The late August sun hung low over Millstone, Nevada, casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt of Route 50. The small highway town, population 3,200, was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where the loudest sound on a Tuesday evening was usually the bell above Murphy's diner door. But tonight was different. Frank Morrison sat at his usual corner booth inside Murphy's, nursing his third cup of black coffee. At 72 years old, his hands weren't as steady as they used to be, and the steam rising from the cup blurred slightly in his vision. The diner smelled like grease and nostalgia, hash browns, bacon, and the faint scent of bleach from where Darla had mopped near the kitchen. Frank had been coming to Murphy's for 40 years, first as a young firefighter grabbing breakfast before dawn shifts, then as a captain bringing his crew in after long calls, and now as a widower filling empty evenings with coffee and the low murmur of familiar voices. "You want pie, Frank?" Darla called from behind the counter, her grey hair pulled back in the same bun she'd worn since the 90s. "Not tonight, Darla, just the coffee." Through the window, Frank watched the sun paint the distant mountains purple and gold. His reflection stared back, weathered skin, white beard trimmed short, eyes that had seen too many fires and too many funerals. 5 years since Martha passed. 3 years since the department gave him the gold watch and the retirement plaque that now collected dust in his garage. The rumble started low like distant thunder. Frank felt it before he heard it, a vibration in his coffee cup, ripples spreading across the dark surface. Then came the sound, deep, guttural, the unmistakable roar of multiple motorcycles approaching fast. Darla froze mid-pour. Tommy Chen, the line cook, stepped out from the kitchen, spatula still in hand. The handful of other customers, a trucker named Bill, young couple passing through, and old Mrs. Patterson, all turned toward the windows. The bikes came around the bend like a steel river, at least 20 of them, maybe more. Chrome gleamed in the dying light, black leather. Patches on their backs, the unmistakable Death's Head logo that made Frank's stomach tighten. Hell's Angels. The motorcycles filled the parking lot, engines cutting off one by one until an eerie silence replaced the thunder. Frank counted them. 23 riders, all wearing the red and white colors. Big men, most of them, with beards and tattoos, bandanas and dark sunglasses, despite the approaching dusk. "Jesus Christ," Bill the trucker whispered, sliding down in his booth. The club's president, a massive man with a grey beard braided at the chin, dismounted first. He said something Frank couldn't hear, and the others formed up around him, creating a semicircle facing the diner. Then Frank saw him. Walking between 2 bikers, hands visibly shaking, was Deputy Marcus Webb. The young deputy, couldn't be more than 28, still wore his tan uniform, but his face was pale, sweating. He wasn't walking voluntarily. The 2 bikers flanking him had their hands on his shoulders, guiding him forward with the kind of pressure that left no room for discussion. "Oh, God," Darla breathed. "They're going to kill that boy right here in the parking lot." Frank's heart hammered. His phone was in his truck, no way to call for backup without being seen. The nearest sheriff's station was in Ely, 30 miles west. By the time anyone arrived, more engines. Another group of bikes appeared. Not Hell's Angels this time. Different patches. Frank recognized the colors. Desert Rattlers, a smaller club that had been causing trouble through central Nevada for the past year. Drugs mostly. Some extortion. The kind of outfit that gave all bikers a bad name. 7 of them pulled up across the parking lot from the Angels, creating a tense standoff with the diner caught in the middle. The Desert Rattlers leader, a wiry man with a shaved head and a scar running from his eyebrow to his jaw, dismounted and pointed at Deputy Webb. "That's our business you're holding," he called out. His voice carried clearly through the still evening air. "Hand him over." The Angels' president didn't move. "Don't think so." "You protecting a cop now? That's not how this works, old man. This isn't about the badge." The president's voice was calm, almost conversational. "This is about debt." Frank watched, frozen, as more Angels dismounted and formed a wall between Deputy Webb and the Desert Rattlers. It wasn't aggressive, not yet, but the message was clear. "You'll have to go through us." Inside the diner, Mrs. Patterson was crying softly. The young couple had ducked beneath their table. Tommy had his phone out, but his hands were shaking too badly to dial. "Don't," Frank said quietly. "Not yet. Frank, they're going to—" "Just wait." Frank couldn't explain it, but something felt wrong about the scene. Not wrong like violence was about to explode, though that seemed likely, but wrong like he was missing something important. The Angels weren't acting like predators, they were acting like protectors. One of the Desert Rattlers revved his engine aggressively. Last chance. Give us the cop, and we ride away. Nobody gets hurt. Everybody rides away, the Angels' president countered. But the deputy stays with us. Why? What's he to you? The president paused, and in that pause, Frank saw something that made his breath catch. The big man turned, just slightly, and looked directly through the diner window, directly at Frank. Their eyes met, and Frank remembered. The memory hit him like a physical blow. 16 years ago, Highway 50, 3 miles east of town. The wreck was already fully involved when Engine 7 arrived. A semi had jackknifed and hit a motorcycle. The rider was pinned under burning debris, screaming. Frank had crawled into that inferno with his Halligan bar and his turnout gear smoking, dragged that rider out seconds before the gas tank exploded. He'd never seen the rider's face. Too much smoke, too much chaos. The man had been airlifted to Reno, and Frank had moved on to the next call, the next fire, the next emergency. It was the job. You didn't do it for recognition. But now, standing in a parking lot 16 years later, that rider was staring back at him. The Angels' president raised his hand, pointed at Frank through the window, and nodded once. Then he turned back to the Desert Rattlers. The cops got information we need. Personal information about someone who matters to us. You want him? You're going to have to take him. And that, he paused, letting the weight of his words settle, that's not going to happen. The Desert Rattlers exchanged glances. 7 against 23 weren't good odds, even for men stupid enough to threaten a Hell's Angels charter. But Scarface wasn't done. This isn't over. No, the president agreed. It's not. The Desert Rattlers fired up their bikes and rolled out slowly, maintaining eye contact the whole way. Not a retreat, a tactical withdrawal. The kind that promised they'd be back with reinforcements. As soon as they were gone, the Angels moved. Half of them mounted up and headed east, clearly following the Rattlers at a distance. The others formed up around Deputy Webb, who looked like he might collapse. The president walked toward the diner entrance. Frank stood up. Frank, don't... Darla started, but Frank was already moving, pushing through the door and stepping into the parking lot. The evening air was cooler now, carrying the scent of sagebrush and engine oil. The president stopped 3 feet away. Up close, Frank could see the scars on the man's hands, the burn marks on his left forearm, marks that matched the pattern of motorcycle exhaust pipes. Captain Morrison, the man said. His voice was rough, weathered by years of wind and tobacco. Been a long time. You were the rider, the semi-crash. Yeah, the man extended his hand. Name's Daniel Reeves. I go by Reeves. I'm the charter president for the Northern Nevada Angels. Frank shook his hand. The grip was firm, respectful. You didn't have to, whatever this is about, you didn't need to protect a deputy on my account. Yeah, we did. Reeves glanced back at Deputy Webb, who was sitting on the curb now, head in his hands. Kid stumbled onto something he shouldn't have. The Rattlers have been running meth through Millstone, using the old mine roads. Webb found their stash house, but he did it off the books. Wanted to be a hero, I guess. They found out, put a price on his head. And you? We don't deal with that poison. Never have, never will. Reeves's jaw tightened. The Rattlers are making all clubs look bad, and we're done tolerating it. When we heard they were coming for Webb tonight, we decided to intervene. But why here? Why now? Reeves looked at Frank for a long moment. Because 16 years ago you crawled into a fire to pull me out. I was 25 years old, stupid, riding too fast in the rain. You didn't know me. Didn't know I wore these colors. You just saw a man who needed help, and you helped him. Frank felt his throat tighten. That was the job. Maybe, but you gave me a second chance at life, Captain. I got married after that, got 2 kids now, built a business. I wouldn't have any of that if you'd hesitated, if you'd seen my patches and decided I wasn't worth saving. Reeves's voice dropped lower. We protect those who protected us. That's the code. The Rattlers aren't going to just let this go. No, they're not. Reeves turned and gestured to his men. That's why we're staying. Staying? In Millstone. We're setting up a watch, round the clock. The Rattlers want Webb. They'll have to go through us. And once this is over, once we've dealt with their operation, we'll make sure the deputy here gets proper protection through official channels. Deputy Webb looked up at that, his face a mixture of shame and gratitude. I screwed up. I should have called it in properly, but I wanted— You wanted to make a difference, Reeves interrupted. Can't fault a man for that. But you nearly got yourself killed doing it alone. Frank looked around at the angels still in the parking lot. They weren't posturing or threatening. They were alert, professional, scanning the highway in both directions like trained security. These weren't thugs looking for trouble. They were men honoring a debt. How long? Frank asked. As long as it takes, Reeves said. A few days, maybe a week. We've got people working on information about the Rattlers' supply chain. Once we have enough evidence, we'll hand it to the state police. Clean, anonymous. No one needs to know the angels were involved. The whole town saw you ride in. Reeves smiled slightly. The whole town saw us stop a deputy from getting killed by drug dealers. That's what they'll remember. That's what matters. Frank nodded slowly. He should probably be scared. Should probably call the sheriff anyway. Report the standoff. Let the law handle it. But looking at Reeves, at the men standing watch, at Deputy Webb alive and breathing. My house is 2 blocks south, Frank said quietly. Second floor has a good view of the highway if you need a vantage point. Reeves studied him. You sure about that, Captain? I'm sure that I didn't pull you out of that fire so the Rattlers could finish what the wreck started. If you're serious about protecting that kid and stopping the drug trafficking— Frank took a breath. Then, yeah, I'm sure. Appreciate it. Reeves extended his hand again, and Frank shook it. We'll keep a low profile. Won't bring any trouble to your doorstep. Trouble's already here, you're just the one standing between it and innocent people. As Frank turned to head back into the diner, Darla stood in the doorway, arms crossed, tears on her cheeks. You're crazy, Frank Morrison. Probably, Frank agreed, but I've been crazy before. The next hours passed in a strange blur. The angels didn't leave. Instead, they spread out, some positioning bikes at key intersections, others setting up watch points on the rooftops of closed businesses. Reeves himself came to Frank's house with 2 others, politely accepting the offer of coffee and positioning themselves by the upstairs windows with a clear view of Route 50. Deputy Webb, after much convincing, agreed to stay at Frank's as well, sleeping on the couch downstairs with an angel named Marcos, a former Marine, keeping watch by the door. Frank lay in his bedroom, staring at the ceiling, listening to the low murmur of voices from downstairs. Martha's side of the bed was still empty, still cold, but for the first time in months, the house felt less like a tomb and more like something else, something purposeful. Around midnight, Frank heard the rumble of engines in the distance. He rose and looked out the window. More motorcycles approaching from the east, but these weren't Hell's Angels. The Desert Rattlers were coming back. And they'd brought friends. The orange glow of dawn crept over Millstone's eastern ridge, painting the weathered buildings in shades of copper and rust. Frank hadn't slept. Neither had anyone else in his house. From his upstairs window, he counted the motorcycles parked in strategic positions around the small town. The Desert Rattlers had arrived around 1 a.m. Not 7 riders this time, but 19. They'd circled through town once, engines loud and aggressive, before parking at the old Sinclair station on the north end. Watching, waiting. The Hells Angels hadn't flinched. Reeves had made a single phone call, and by 2 a.m., more angels had rolled in from Reno, 12 additional riders, including 2 women with the same death's head patch and eyes that missed nothing. They'd taken up positions at Murphy's Diner, the post office, and the abandoned grain silo that overlooked the highway. Millstone had become a chessboard, and its residents were trapped in the middle of a game they didn't understand. Frank descended the stairs quietly. The house smelled like coffee and cigarette smoke. Marcos had been smoking on the back porch, careful to keep the smoke outside, per Frank's house rules. Deputy Webb was awake now, sitting at Frank's kitchen table, with his head in his hands, looking like he'd aged 10 years overnight. "Morning, Captain," Reeves said from the living room. He stood by the window, backlit by the rising sun, looking out at the street with the patience of a man who'd waited out worse situations. 2 other angels, a heavy-set man named Pike and a lean, quiet rider called Mouse, sat on Frank's couch, weapons Frank chose not to ask about undoubtedly within reach. "They're still out there," Frank observed, pouring himself coffee from the pot Marcos had brewed. "They'll stay there until they think they have an advantage." Reeves accepted a cup when Frank offered it. "Probably waiting for us to let our guard down. Won't happen." Deputy Webb looked up, his young face drawn with exhaustion and guilt. "This is my fault, all of it. I should have never— Shoulda, woulda, coulda." Pike's voice was surprisingly gentle for such a large man. You made a mistake, kid. We all have. Difference is you're getting a chance to learn from it. How'd you even find out about the Rattlers operation? Frank asked, sitting across from Webb. The deputy swallowed hard. About 3 months ago, I pulled over a van for a broken taillight. Driver was nervous, kept looking in the rear view. I ran the plates, rental paid for in cash in Las Vegas. When I asked to search the vehicle, he consented, but his hands were shaking. Found a false panel in the back. Nothing in it, but it smelled like chemicals. Reeves nodded slowly. Meth manufacturing leaves a residue. Smart catch. I should have reported it immediately. Called DEA, state police, somebody. Webb's voice cracked slightly. But I wanted to prove myself. Wanted to show Sheriff Bowman I was more than just a small-town deputy who hands out speeding tickets. Pride, Mouse said quietly. It was the first time Frank had heard him speak. Gets us all eventually. Webb continued, his words spilling out like a confession. I started following leads on my own time, talked to people, watched traffic patterns. About 2 weeks ago, I found their stash house, old mining office up on Copper Ridge Road. They'd been using it to store product before distribution runs south toward Vegas. And you went inside, Reeves said. It wasn't a question. I was careful, wore gloves, didn't disturb anything. Just took photos with my phone, documented everything. I was planning to take it all to the sheriff this week, build an airtight case. Except they knew you'd been there, Pike said. Webb nodded miserably. I didn't realize they had cameras, wireless ones, hidden in the rafters. By the time I figured it out, they'd already ID'd me. 2 nights ago, I got a message on my personal phone. A video of me inside the stash house and a text. Dead cops don't testify. That's when I knew I was screwed. Frank absorbed this information, his firefighter's mind assessing the problem like a structure fire. Identify the fuel source, locate the exits, determine the best approach. Why didn't you go to your sheriff then? Because Bowman's old school. He would have put me on administrative leave, started an investigation into why I was conducting unauthorized surveillance. By the time that cleared up, if it cleared up, the Rattlers would have moved their operation, destroyed evidence, maybe even gotten to me first. Webb looked at Reeves. I didn't know the Angels were involved until last night. When they surrounded me at Murphy's, I thought, You thought we were there to finish the job, Reeves said. Can't blame you for that. Our reputation isn't exactly spotless. He set down his coffee cup. But here's what you didn't know. We've been tracking the Desert Rattlers for months. They're not just running meth. They're trying to expand territory, pushing into areas where established clubs have kept hard drugs out. Last month, one of their dealers sold to a 14-year-old girl in Sparks. She OD'd in her parents' bathroom. The room fell silent. Outside, Frank heard Millstone waking up. A car engine starting, someone's dog barking, the distant clang of the hardware store's metal gate rolling up. The girl survived, Reeves continued, his voice harder now. But barely. Her parents brought it to us because they knew the local police couldn't act without evidence, and by the time they got evidence, the dealers would be gone. We've been building our own case against the Rattlers. When we heard they'd put a target on a deputy, even one who'd screwed up, we decided it was time to act. So this isn't just about paying back a life debt, Frank said, understanding dawning. This is about territory, about keeping drugs away from kids. It's about both. Reeves met Frank's eyes. I owe you my life, Captain. That's personal. But this thing with the Rattlers, that's business. Club business. They crossed lines we don't tolerate. The fact that their target happened to be connected to the man who saved me, that just made it easier to convince the charter to commit resources. A phone buzzed. Mouse pulled out an old flip phone, read a text, and looked at Reeves. Hawk says the Rattlers are moving. 5 bikes heading west on 50, others staying at the Sinclair. They're splitting their force, Pike observed. Testing our response. Reeves thought for a moment. Tell Hawk to follow at distance. Cameras only, no engagement. If they're going for reinforcements, I want to know from where. Mouse stepped outside to make the call. Frank stood and walked to the window. Down the street, he could see Darla opening Murphy's Diner. A few early morning customers would be arriving soon. Ranchers, truckers, the folks who kept Millstone alive. They'd see the motorcycles. They'd hear the rumors. Fear would spread faster than facts. The town's going to panic, Frank said. By noon, everyone will know there's 2 biker gangs squaring off on Main Street. Some people will leave. Others will barricade themselves inside. And somebody's going to call the state police or the FBI. Let them, Reeves said. We're not breaking any laws. We're sitting on public property waiting. If the cops come, we cooperate fully. We've got nothing to hide. The Rattlers might see a police response as their opportunity to act, Webb said. If they think law enforcement is going to break up the Angels' protection detail, then they'd be right. Frank turned from the window. You can't maintain this standoff indefinitely. Eventually, something's going to break. Reeves pulled out his own phone, an expensive-looking smartphone that seemed out of place in his scarred hands. He pulled up a map, zoomed in on the area around Millstone. We've got people tracking the Rattlers' supply chain. By tonight, we'll know where their main lab is, who's supplying the precursor chemicals, and which corrupt officials are on their payroll. Once we have that information, we hand it to the DEA anonymously. The Rattlers get raided, their operation collapses, and Deputy Webb here becomes irrelevant to their interests. That's assuming they don't make a move before tonight, Pike pointed out. They will. Reeves zoomed the map out further. Those 5 bikes heading west, they're going to Carson City. There's a support club there, not Angels, not Rattlers, but sympathetic to the Rattlers' goals. They'll pick up maybe 10 more riders, come back heavily armed, and try to overwhelm us with numbers. How many can you bring in? Frank asked. We've got 38 riders in town right now. I can call in another 20 from Sacramento by mid-afternoon. That's 58 total. Reeves looked at Webb. What kind of firepower do the Rattlers usually carry? Webb shook his head. I don't know. I never got close enough to find out. Assume they're armed, Pike said. Handguns minimum, probably some rifles. They're drug dealers, not soldiers. They'll have weapons, but they won't have discipline. Frank's mind raced through scenarios. His firefighting experience had taught him to think in terms of worst-case possibilities. If they come back with 15 bikes, that's 24 Rattlers total, against 58 Angels. They'd be outnumbered more than 2 to 1. They'd have to know they'd lose a direct confrontation. Unless they're not planning a direct confrontation, Reeves said quietly. The words hung in the air like smoke. Mouse came back inside. Hawk confirmed. 5 Rattlers just pulled into a clubhouse in Carson City. Place called the Iron Vultures. Vultures are bottom feeders, Reeves muttered. Makes sense they'd align with the Rattlers. He looked at Frank. The play isn't to hit us head-on. It's to hit something we care about protecting. Understanding struck Frank like cold water. They're going to target civilians, force you to spread your people thin, defending multiple locations. That would be my play, Pike agreed grimly. Reeves was already moving, phone to his ear. Joanna, I need protection details on the following locations: Murphy's Diner, the elementary school, the medical clinic, and the Morrison residence. Minimum 3 riders each location, rotating shifts. As Reeves organized his forces, Frank pulled Deputy Webb aside. You need to contact your sheriff, not officially, not on record, but he needs to know what's happening. He'll pull me from town. Put me in protective custody, which might be exactly what you need. Webb shook his head stubbornly. If I run now, the Rattlers win. They'll know they can intimidate law enforcement, and the Angels will have put themselves at risk for nothing. The Angels are at risk anyway, Frank said, but he understood the deputy's logic. Sometimes courage wasn't about being fearless. It was about being terrified and standing your ground anyway. By 8 a.m., Millstone's Main Street looked like a scene from a Western movie, except instead of horses there were Harley-Davidsons. The Hells Angels had positioned themselves at key intersections, visible but not threatening, their presence both a warning and a promise. The Desert Rattlers remained at the Sinclair station, fewer in number now but no less menacing. Frank walked to Murphy's Diner, needing to check on Darla, needing to feel like he was doing something other than hiding in his house. 2 Angels, both women, both looking capable of handling trouble, sat at the counter, drinking coffee and watching the street through the windows. Frank Morrison, you've lost your mind, Darla said as he entered, but her voice held more worry than anger. Whole town's talking. Half the folks are saying the Angels are heroes for protecting that deputy. Other half are saying we're about to become a war zone. Both things can be true, Frank said, sitting at his usual booth. The morning light streaming through the window made everything look deceptively peaceful. You trust them? The Angels? Frank thought about Reeves's handshake, about the 16-year-old debt being honored, about men willing to stand between a young deputy and drug dealers who'd kill him. Yeah, I think I do. And if the shooting starts, then we get everyone inside and pray it ends quickly. Darla poured him coffee without asking. Your Martha would have had something to say about all this. She would have said I was a stubborn old fool. Frank smiled sadly. Then she would have started organizing the town response, making sure everyone had a safe place to shelter. Well, somebody ought to do that. Sheriff Bowman's over in Ely until Thursday. State police are spread thin. If things go bad, we're on our own. Frank nodded. I'll talk to Mayor Chen. We should set up a community meeting, establish protocols, use the high school gym as a shelter if needed. But even as he said it, Frank knew that community meetings and protocols wouldn't matter if the Rattlers decided to escalate. This wasn't a natural disaster where preparation and planning could save lives. This was human violence, unpredictable and explosive, and the only thing standing between Millstone and chaos was a group of bikers honoring an old debt. His phone rang. Reeves. Captain, we've got a problem. The 5 Rattlers who went to Carson City are heading back. But they picked up 14 riders, not 10, and Hawk says they're loading something into saddlebags and cargo nets. Something heavy. Frank's blood ran cold. Weapons. Or explosives. We're not sure. But if they're planning what I think they're planning, Reeves's voice was tight. They're not coming to negotiate. Through the diner window, Frank saw the first of the returning motorcycles appear on the eastern horizon, black specks growing larger, engines roaring, carrying violence toward his town. How long? Frank asked. 20 minutes, maybe less. What do you need from me? There was a pause. Then Reeves said something Frank never expected to hear from a Hells Angels president. Pray, Captain. Pray we're wrong about what they're carrying. And pray that if we're right, no innocent people get caught in the crossfire. Frank ended the call and looked at Darla. Get everyone inside. Lock the doors. Lock. Call Mayor Chen and tell him to activate the emergency alert system. Frank. Now, Darla. As she reached for the phone, Frank stood and walked to the window, watching those black specks grow larger, watching violence approach his town like a storm he couldn't stop. Only weather. And for the first time since Martha's funeral, Frank Morrison prayed. The sound of 19 motorcycles approaching Millstone was like thunder rolling down from the mountains, deep, ominous, promising a storm that couldn't be avoided. Frank stood on the sidewalk outside Murphy's diner, feeling the vibration in his chest as the Desert Rattlers and their Iron Vulture reinforcements entered town from the east. Reeves appeared beside him, moving with surprising speed for such a large man. Captain, you need to get inside. This is my town, Frank said quietly. I'm not hiding while it tears itself apart. Respectfully, if you're standing here when the bullets start flying, you become a liability we have to protect. That divides our attention. Reeves's voice was firm but not unkind. The best way you can help right now is to coordinate civilian safety. Get people off the street, keep them calm, and stay out of the line of fire. Frank wanted to argue, but the logic was sound. He was 72 years old, unarmed, and not trained for this kind of confrontation. What about Webb? He's at your house with Marcos and 3 others. 5-man security detail, all armed already. If the Rattlers want him, they'll have to go through 4 Hells Angels first. Reeves glanced at the approaching motorcycles. But I don't think Webb is their primary target anymore. Then what is? Us. They want to make a statement, show that the Angels can't just roll into someone else's territory and throw their weight around. Reeves pulled out his phone, sent a quick text. We've got 58 people here, they've got 24. But they've got surprise on their side, and based on how they're riding, they've got a plan. The motorcycles were visible now, less than a mile out, moving in a tight formation. The lead riders carried something Frank couldn't quite make out. Long objects wrapped in canvas. Those are rifles, Frank said, his firefighter's eye recognizing the distinctive shapes. They're not even hiding them. Reeves's jaw tightened. Pike, Mouse, get everyone inside. Clear the street. Now. The order rippled through the Angels positioned around town. Within seconds, the riders were moving with military precision, knocking on doors, guiding residents inside businesses, clearing parked cars from potential lines of fire. The 2 female Angels from Murphy's diner emerged and began directing traffic, their voices calm but commanding. Frank helped Darla bring in Tommy Chen and his wife from the hardware store next door. Mrs. Patterson was already inside, praying quietly in a corner booth. Bill the trucker had wisely chosen to stay overnight, and now he sat with his back to the wall, eyes wide but steady. How many people are still out there? Frank asked one of the female Angels. Her patch identified her as Joanna, Sergeant-at-Arms. We've cleared the main street, but there's at least 40 people in their homes who won't come out. Stubborn or scared, hard to say which. Joanna moved to the window, binoculars in hand. Rattlers are stopping at the Sinclair station, consolidating with the riders they left behind. Through the window, Frank watched the scene unfold. The Desert Rattlers and Iron Vultures had formed up in the parking lot of the old gas station. 24 men, most with rifles now visible, some with handguns holstered at their sides. They weren't hiding their weapons. They weren't pretending this was anything other than what it was, a show of force. Scarface, the Desert Rattlers' leader, dismounted and walked to the front of the formation. He pulled out a megaphone from one of the saddlebags. "Hell's Angels." His voice crackled through the morning air, bouncing off the buildings. "You've got one chance to walk away from this. Give us the cop, get on your bikes, and ride north. Do that and nobody gets hurt." Reeves, standing in the middle of Main Street with Pike and Mouse flanking him, didn't move. He simply stood there, arms crossed, waiting. "We've got 24 guns and nothing to lose," Scarface continued. "You want to die protecting some small-town deputy who doesn't even know your names? For what? Honor? Respect? That shit doesn't stop bullets." Still, Reeves didn't respond. Frank felt his heart pounding. This was wrong. Everything about this felt wrong. The Rattlers had to know they were outnumbered, had to know that even with rifles, a firefight in the middle of a town would bring federal law enforcement down on them within hours. This display was either suicidal or... "It's a distraction," Frank said suddenly. Joanna turned to him. "What?" "Look at them. They're all standing in the open, making noise, drawing attention. But drug dealers don't think like soldiers. They think like criminals. They don't want a fair fight. They want..." Frank's phone rang. It was Marcos. "Captain, we've got a problem at your house. 4 men just pulled up in a truck. They're not wearing colors, but they're armed. Handguns. They're trying to look like contractors, but they're going for Webb," Frank interrupted. "The motorcycle show is a diversion. The real assault is happening at my house." Joanna was already moving, speaking rapidly into her radio. "All units, this is Sergeant. We've got a secondary threat at the Morrison residence. Diversion in play, I repeat, diversion in play." Reeves heard the transmission and made a quick assessment. He turned to the Angels positioned along Main Street and made a series of hand signals. Immediately, 10 riders peeled off and headed toward Frank's neighborhood, engines roaring. Scarface saw the movement and smiled. Through the megaphone, he announced, "Guess you made your choice." The Desert Rattlers began moving forward, walking their bikes slowly down Main Street, rifles held casually but ready. It was intimidation, pure and simple. A slow advance designed to force the Angels into making the first move. But Reeves didn't take the bait. Instead, he pulled out his own phone and dialed a number. "Sheriff Bowman? This is Daniel Reeves, president of the Northern Nevada Hells Angels Charter. I'm standing on Main Street in Millstone, and I'm about to be fired upon by members of the Desert Rattlers MC and the Iron Vultures MC. They're armed with rifles. They've threatened civilian lives, and they've dispatched an assault team to attack a law enforcement officer's protective detail." He paused. "I'm calling to formally request emergency assistance and to inform you that my people will be defending themselves and the residents of this town using any means necessary. We'll cooperate fully with law enforcement after the situation is resolved." He ended the call and looked at Pike. "Now we wait." "They're not going to wait," Pike said, watching the advancing Rattlers. "They'll open fire before backup arrives." "Maybe. Maybe not, but now it's on record. We called for help. We tried to de-escalate. Whatever happens next, the law will know who the aggressors were." Frank's phone rang again. Marcos, his voice tense. "Captain, the men at your house tried to breach the front door. We fired warning shots. They're retreating to their truck, but they've got explosives, some kind of charges. I think they were planning to blow through the wall and grab Webb in the chaos." "Where's Webb now?" "We moved him to your basement. He's secure. But if they come back with those charges..." Frank made a decision. "I'm coming to you." "Captain, no. That's my house, Marcos. My home. And Deputy Webb is under my protection just as much as yours." Frank looked at Joanna. "I need to get to my house." "That's not a good idea." "I know, but I'm going anyway." Joanna studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "I'll drive you. Stay low, and if I tell you to hit the floor, you hit the floor. Understood?" "Understood." They moved fast. Joanna had a truck parked behind the diner, a big Ford F-250 with reinforced panels. Frank climbed into the passenger seat, and they pulled out onto a side street, avoiding the main confrontation. As they drove the 2 blocks to Frank's neighborhood, he could hear gunfire in the distance. Not the sustained fire of a battle, but single shots. Warning shots, probably. Both sides still trying to avoid the point of no return. Frank's house appeared intact, but the street was chaos. The 10 angels who'd arrived were spread out, using parked cars and brick mailboxes for cover. The truck full of armed men had retreated to the corner, idling, but not leaving. A standoff within a standoff. Joanna parked the truck perpendicular to Frank's driveway, using it as additional cover. "Stay behind the vehicle, don't expose yourself unnecessarily." Frank nodded and climbed out, crouching low. He could see Marcos through his front window, rifle in hand, watching the street. The scene was surreal. His quiet residential street transformed into a battlefield, his home into a fortress. One of the angels, a younger man with a shaved head, jogged over. "Situation stable for now. They tried once. We stopped them, but they're waiting for something." "Waiting for what?" Frank asked. The answer came in the form of more engines, 2 more trucks arriving from the north, circling around to flank the angels' position. 6 additional men, all armed. "They're trying to draw us into a crossfire," Joanna said calmly. "Force us to either abandon the house or split our forces." Frank's mind raced. This wasn't just about Webb anymore. This wasn't even about drugs or territory. This had become about pride, about which side would blink first, about violent men with guns and no good options. "There's another way," Frank said suddenly. "Marcos, is the basement access secure?" Through the window, Marcos gave a thumbs up. "Then we don't need to hold the whole house. We just need to hold the basement and buy time until the sheriff arrives." Frank looked at Joanna. "How long until backup?" "Sheriff's 40 minutes out. State police are closer, maybe 20 minutes. Then we go underground. Literally." It took precious minutes to coordinate, but the plan was solid. While the angels maintained their positions outside, Frank, Joanna, and 2 other riders entered the house through the back door. They found Marcos and Webb in the basement, which had been Martha's craft room before her passing, now a dusty space full of fabric bins and old furniture. "There's a storm cellar access here," Frank said, pulling aside a shelf to reveal a reinforced door Martha had insisted on installing years ago. Nevada might not get tornadoes, but the old-timers remembered the mining accidents, the cave-ins, the occasional earthquake. The storm cellar had been Martha's insurance policy. They moved Webb into the storm cellar. It was cramped and dark, but the walls were reinforced concrete, and there was only one entry point. Defensible. "Marcos, you and Webb stay here," Joanna ordered. "Keep this door sealed. Don't open it for anyone except Reeves or me, and only if we give the all-clear signal." "What's the signal?" Marcos asked. Joanna thought for a second. 16 years. That's the phrase. Anyone who knows why we're here will know what it means. Frank understood. The 16-year debt, the fire, the moment that had set all of this in motion. With Webb secured, the defensive strategy shifted. The angels no longer needed to protect the whole house, just delay any assault until law enforcement arrived. They collapsed their perimeter, using Frank's house as the central point, covering all approaches. Upstairs, Frank heard the sound of breaking glass. The men from the trucks were testing the defenses, throwing rocks trying to provoke a response. The angels held their fire, disciplined and controlled. Frank's radio, borrowed from one of the riders, crackled. Reeves's voice, "Situation on Main Street is escalating. Rattlers fired shots over our heads. We returned fire. No casualties yet, but it's getting hot." "How long can you hold?" Joanna asked. "As long as we need to. But Captain Morrison's house is the weak point. If they breach your position, this whole thing falls apart. We're secure. Webb is in a hardened location. They'll need explosives or a lot of time to get to him." "They've got explosives." Frank looked out the window and saw one of the men from the trucks carrying what looked like a shaped charge, the kind used in controlled demolitions. His firefighters' training identified it immediately. That much explosive, improperly placed, could bring down half the house. "They're going to blow the foundation?" Frank said quietly. Joanna saw it too. She keyed the radio. "Reeves, we need backup now. They've got demo charges. I'm sending everyone I can spare, but if I pull too many from Main Street, the rattlers will push through." Frank felt the weight of the impossible choice settling over the situation. Hold Main Street and risk losing Webb. Protect Webb and risk losing the town. There was no good option. Then he heard the sirens. Distant at first, but growing louder. Not the sheriff's sirens, but multiple vehicles. State police, federal agents, maybe even ATF given the weapons involved. The cavalry wasn't 40 minutes away. They were arriving now. Through the window, Frank saw the men with the explosives hesitate. They heard the sirens too. A moment of uncertainty, of calculations being made. Scarface's voice carried from Main Street, the megaphone abandoned now, just shouting, "Fall back! Everybody fall back!" The desert rattlers and iron vultures scattered like leaves in wind, engines firing up, tires squealing. They fled in every direction, east, west, some even cutting through yards and side streets. The disciplined formation dissolved into desperate flight. The men outside Frank's house abandoned the explosives and sprinted for their trucks, racing away before the first state police cruiser appeared on the horizon. Within minutes, the street was filled with law enforcement, Nevada Highway Patrol, state police, and a black SUV with federal plates that Frank guessed was either FBI or ATF. Officers emerged with rifles and body armor, securing the scene, checking for casualties. Sheriff Bowman, a weathered man in his 60s with a silver mustache, found Reeves on Main Street. Frank, walking back toward the diner with Joanna, arrived just in time to hear the conversation. "You got a lot of explaining to do," Bowman said, but his voice wasn't angry. It was tired, resigned. "I called you," Reeves said simply. "Told you we were defending ourselves and your deputy. Everything else is just details. Details like an armed standoff in the middle of my town. Details like 24 bikers with rifles facing off against another 24 bikers with rifles. Details like us stopping a drug operation that's been running through your county for 6 months while you were spread too thin to notice." Reeves pulled out his phone and handed it to Bowman. "Everything's there. Photos of the stash house, GPS coordinates, names of dealers, supply routes. We've been tracking the desert rattlers for months. Deputy Webb stumbled onto their operation, and they put a target on him. We kept him alive until you could get here." Bowman scrolled through the information, his expression darkening. "This is comprehensive. This is better intel than most law enforcement agencies could gather. We've got resources, and we've got motivation. The rattlers have been dealing meth, selling to kids, destroying communities. We don't tolerate that." "Because you're such upstanding citizens," Bowman said dryly. "Because some lines don't get crossed, not in our territory, not on our watch." Reeves gestured toward Frank. "And because 16 years ago, a good man saved my life without asking what I was worth. Today I returned the favor by protecting someone who matters to him." Bowman looked at Frank. "You vouching for these men, Captain Morrison?" Frank thought about the question. About Reeves and Marcos and Pike and Mouse and Joanna and all the others who'd spent the night protecting his town, protecting Webb, standing between violence and innocent people. About the difference between the law and justice, between the letter and the spirit. "Yeah, Sheriff," Frank said. "I am." Bowman sighed heavily. "We're going to need statements. From everyone. And the federal agents are going to want to know why a motorcycle club had better intelligence on a drug operation than the DEA. "We'll cooperate," Reeves said. "Fully. Our only condition is that Deputy Webb isn't punished for his initiative. He found the stash house legally, documented it properly. If he'd brought it to you first, we wouldn't be standing here. But he didn't break any laws. That's not for you to decide. No. But it's for you to consider." Sheriff Bowman spent the next 6 hours sorting through the chaos. The federal agents, ATF, as Frank had guessed, took possession of the explosives abandoned at Frank's house and began processing the evidence the angels had gathered on the desert rattlers. Statements were taken, reports were filed, and slowly the machinery of official justice began to turn. The Hells Angels remained in Millstone, cooperative and professional, answering every question, providing every piece of information requested. By afternoon, it was clear that they weren't suspects. They were witnesses, victims even, of an assault they'd defended against. As the sun began to set, painting the mountains the same shades of copper and gold as the previous evening, Reeves found Frank outside his house. The street was quieter now. Most of the law enforcement vehicles gone, just a few state police cruisers remaining to maintain presence. "How's your house?" Reeves asked. "Broken windows, bullet holes in the siding. Nothing that can't be fixed." Frank looked at the damage and felt surprisingly calm. "How's your people?" "Tired, ready to head home, but satisfied." Reeves pulled out a pack of cigarettes, offered one to Frank, who declined. "The feds are moving on the Rattlers lab tonight. Going to be a big bust. Career-making for some of them. And the Angels get none of the credit. Don't want the credit. We just wanted them gone." Reeves lit his cigarette, exhaled slowly. "Webb's going to be fine, by the way. Sheriff's recommending him for a commendation. kid screwed up, but he was trying to do the right thing. That counts for something. What about you? You're just going to ride away? That's generally how it works. Reeves smiled slightly. We're not heroes, Captain. We're just men who paid a debt. You saved my life 16 years ago. Today I made sure your town stayed safe. That squares us. Frank shook his head. A life debt doesn't square that easy. Maybe not, but it's a start. Reeves finished his cigarette and ground it out carefully, pocketing the butt. No littering, Frank noted with amusement. If you ever need anything, you've got my number. And I mean anything. You need help, protection, information, you call and the angels will answer. I appreciate that. And Captain? Reeves extended his hand one final time. Thank you for trusting us, for vouching for us. Most people see the patches and assume the worst. You looked past that, saw us as men, not stereotypes. Frank shook his hand firmly. I saw men honoring their word. That's worth more than any patch or uniform. As the Hells Angels prepared to leave, bikes lining up, engines starting in that distinctive rolling thunder, the residents of Millstone came out of their homes, not to protest or complain, but to watch, to bear witness. Darla stood outside Murphy's diner, arms crossed but nodding respectfully. Mayor Chen and his family stood in their yard. Mrs. Patterson, brave despite her earlier tears, stood on her porch and raised a hand in farewell. Deputy Webb, released from protective custody and standing next to Sheriff Bowman, saluted as the angels rolled past, and Frank stood in his damaged yard, watching 58 motorcycles parade down Main Street in perfect formation, carrying with them the story of a debt paid, a town protected, and the complicated honor that exists in the spaces between law and justice. As the last bike disappeared around the bend, the rumble fading into the distance, Frank heard Darla call out behind him. Coffee, Frank? On the house? He turned and saw his town, his Millstone, still standing, still breathing, still home. Yeah, Darla, Frank said, walking toward the diner. I think I will. 3 weeks later, Frank Morrison sat in his repaired living room, reading the newspaper and listening to the familiar silence of his empty house. The bullet holes in the siding had been patched, the broken windows replaced. The storm cellar access was back behind Martha's old craft shelf, hidden but accessible. From the outside, everything looked normal, but Millstone had changed. The headline in the Ely Times read, Multi-state drug operation dismantled in record bust. The article detailed how ATF and DEA agents had simultaneously raided 17 locations across Nevada, California, and Arizona, seizing over 300 pounds of methamphetamine, 74 firearms, and arresting 38 people, including the entire leadership of the Desert Rattlers MC and the Iron Vultures MC. The article mentioned an anonymous tip from a confidential informant but didn't elaborate. Frank knew better. The intelligence that had made the bust possible had come from months of work by the Hells Angels, surveillance, documentation, tracking supply chains and financial transactions. Work that no law enforcement agency had the resources to undertake in these rural counties where budgets were tight and officers were spread thin. The Hells Angels had done what the system couldn't, then handed the results to the system and walked away. Frank's phone rang. He didn't recognize the number but answered anyway. Captain Morrison, this is Special Agent Davis, ATF. I wanted to thank you personally for your cooperation during the Millstone incident. I just gave a statement, Agent Davis. The real heroes were the people who gathered the intelligence. There was a pause. About that, I know who provided the information, and I know why they were in Millstone that night. What I don't know is whether I should be concerned about ongoing Hells Angels activity in this area. Frank chose his words carefully. The Angels came to protect someone who needed protecting. They stopped a violent assault. They called law enforcement. They cooperated fully with investigators. Does that sound like criminal activity to you? It sounds complicated. Life usually is. Another pause. For what it's worth, Captain, I agree with you. The Angels could have handled this a dozen different ways, most of them ending with bodies and a federal investigation into organized crime. Instead, they showed restraint, discipline, and a surprising respect for the rule of law. That's not what we typically see. Maybe that's because you're usually looking at the worst examples. Maybe. Agent Davis sounded thoughtful. The charges against Deputy Webb have been dropped, by the way. Sheriff Bowman made a compelling case that Webb was conducting legitimate preliminary surveillance that happened to intersect with a larger investigation. Kid's going to keep his job and his reputation. That's good to hear. And, Captain, if you happen to speak with Daniel Reeves or any of his associates, you can tell them the ATF appreciates their civic cooperation. Off the record, of course. Of course. After the call ended, Frank sat in his chair and thought about codes, the written laws that governed society, and the unwritten codes that governed men's actions when laws fell short. The code that had brought Reeves back to Millstone 16 years after Frank pulled him from burning wreckage. The code that had made 58 bikers risk their lives and freedom to protect a deputy they'd never met. The code that said some debts transcended badges and patches. A knock on his door pulled Frank from his thoughts. He opened it to find Deputy Marcus Webb, out of uniform, holding a six-pack of beer. "Got a minute, Captain?" Frank stepped aside. "Always got time for you, Deputy." They sat at Frank's kitchen table and Webb pulled out 2 bottles, opening them both. "I wanted to apologize for putting you in danger, for turning your home into a battleground. Stop," Frank interrupted gently. "You made a mistake trying to be a hero alone, but you were trying to do the right thing. That counts for something. Sheriff Bowman gave me a choice. Stay here in Millstone or transfer to a bigger department where I can learn proper investigative procedures. I'm thinking about taking the transfer." "Running away." Webb shook his head. "Growing up, what happened here taught me I've got good instincts but bad tactics. I need training, experience, mentorship. A small-town department can't provide that." "Bowman can't." "Sheriff Bowman's a good man, but he's old school. He thinks policing is about maintaining order and knowing your community. I think policing is also about proactive investigation, about stopping crime before it escalates. We need both approaches, but I can only learn one of them here." Frank nodded slowly. "Where would you go?" "Reno. They've got an opening in their organized crime unit. After what happened here, they're interested in me." "Organized crime? You mean investigating groups like the Hells Angels?" Webb met Frank's eyes. "I mean investigating real criminals. The Angels aren't criminals, I know that now. They're something else. Something the law doesn't have a good category for." "What category would you put them in?" Webb thought for a long moment. "Guardians, maybe. Operating outside official structures but following their own code. Not always legal, but not necessarily wrong. We need people studying that gray area, understanding it, figuring out how law enforcement can work with groups like the Angels instead of automatically treating them as enemies. That's a dangerous career path." "So is everything worth doing?" Webb finished his beer. "I wanted you to know before I told Sheriff Bowman. You put your life on the line for me. You deserve to know I'm not wasting the second chance your friends gave me." "They're not my friends," Frank said automatically. Then he paused, considered. "Or maybe they are. I'm not sure yet." After Webb left, Frank walked through his house, thinking about second chances and codes and the debt he'd unknowingly created 16 years ago when he'd crawled into burning wreckage to pull out a stranger. He'd been doing his job. Nothing heroic, nothing special, just the job. But to Reeves it had been everything. A second chance at life, at family, at purpose. His phone buzzed with a text message. Unknown number. "Thank you for the coffee and the conversation. If you're ever in Reno, Murphy's Diner isn't the only place that serves good coffee." Frank smiled and saved the number. The town hall meeting was held on a Thursday evening at the high school gymnasium. Mayor Chen had organized it as a community healing dialogue, a chance for Millstone's residents to discuss what had happened, voice concerns, and move forward together. Nearly 200 people attended, filling the bleachers usually reserved for basketball games. Frank sat near the front, watching the mayor and Sheriff Bowman take their places at a folding table on the gymnasium floor. The meeting started with facts. Sheriff Bowman explained the Desert Rattlers operation, the threat to Deputy Webb, and the federal investigation that had resulted from the incident. He spoke carefully, professionally, avoiding any mention of the Hells Angels by name, but the residents weren't interested in carefully worded official statements. They wanted the truth. "Why were the Hells Angels here?" someone shouted from the bleachers. "They were protecting a potential witness," Bowman said. "That's all I can say without compromising ongoing investigations." "But why? What's a motorcycle gang care about protecting cops?" Before Bowman could answer, Frank stood up. The gymnasium fell quiet. Everyone knew Frank Morrison, the retired fire captain who'd lost his wife, lived alone, kept to himself, but was always there when the community needed him. If Frank had something to say, people listened. The Hells Angels were here because of me, Frank said clearly. His voice, trained to cut through the sound of fire and chaos, carried easily across the gymnasium. 16 years ago, I pulled one of their members from a burning wreck. He survived. Last month, when Deputy Webb needed protection, that man, now the club's president, came to repay the debt. Him and 57 other riders. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. So this was personal? Someone asked. It started personal, Frank acknowledged, but it became something bigger. The Angels had been tracking the Desert Rattlers for months because they were dealing drugs in communities where the Angels have presence. When the Rattlers threatened a law enforcement officer, the Angels decided to intervene. They could have handled it violently. They could have made it a gang war that destroyed this town. Instead, they called the sheriff, provided intelligence to federal agents, and stood their ground until proper authorities arrived. They had guns, Mrs. Patterson said, her voice shaking slightly. I saw rifles. Lots of rifles. Yes, ma'am, they were armed. So were the Desert Rattlers who were coming to kill Deputy Webb. The Angels didn't fire first. They held their positions, protected civilians, and waited for law enforcement. When the Rattlers tried to attack my home, where Deputy Webb was being protected, the Angels stopped them without killing anyone. But they're criminals, someone else protested. Hell's Angels. We've all heard the stories. I've heard stories too, Frank said. Some are probably true, some are probably exaggerated. What I know for certain is what I saw. Men honoring a debt, protecting a community, showing restraint when they could have shown violence, and working with law enforcement instead of against it. You can call them whatever you want, but in my book, what they did here was honorable. Mayor Chen cleared his throat. Captain Morrison makes an important point. We can debate the nature of motorcycle clubs all night, but the facts are simple. Our town was threatened by drug dealers, a deputy's life was in danger, and a group of armed citizens intervened to prevent bloodshed until proper authorities could respond. Whether we agree with their methods or their lifestyle, we owe them a debt of gratitude. Not everyone agreed. The meeting continued for another hour, with residents voicing fears about becoming known as a biker-friendly town or attracting more criminal elements. Others argued that the Angels had done what local law enforcement couldn't, stopped a drug operation that had been operating undetected for months. The debate revealed the complicated truth. There were no simple answers. The Hells Angels weren't heroes, but they weren't villains either. They existed in the grey spaces between law and justice, following codes that sometimes aligned with society's rules and sometimes didn't. By the time the meeting ended, no consensus had been reached, but perhaps that was appropriate. Millstone, like the rest of America, was learning to navigate a world where traditional categories, good guys and bad guys, criminals and citizens, were more complicated than the movies suggested. 2 months after the incident, Frank received a package at his door. No return address, just a postmark from Reno. Inside was a leather-bound journal and a handwritten note. Captain Morrison. The club asked me to compile a record of what happened in Millstone, for our history, for our chapter's legacy. I wanted you to have the first copy. Inside, you'll find accounts from every angel who was there, explaining why they came, what they saw, and what it meant to them. You'll read about Pike's daughter, who died of an overdose 10 years ago, and why he'll never tolerate drug dealers. You'll read about Mouse's brother, a cop in Los Angeles, who was killed in the line of duty by a meth addict. You'll read about Joanna, who spent 3 years in prison for assault after defending a woman from an abusive husband when the law failed to act. You'll read stories that don't fit the stereotype. Stories that are complicated, sometimes painful, often contradictory. Stories of men and women who've made mistakes, paid prices, and committed themselves to codes they believe protect what's worth protecting. We're not asking for your approval or your understanding. We're just asking that you see us as what we are, human beings trying to navigate an imperfect world with our own form of honor. The debt is paid, Captain, but the respect remains. Daniel Reeves Frank spent the next week reading the journal. Each entry revealed layers he hadn't seen, personal tragedies, complicated motivations, moments of grace, and moments of failure. The angels who'd protected Millstone weren't saints, but they weren't monsters either. They were men and women who'd chosen a different path, built a different family, and followed a different code. In the back of the journal, on the last page, there was a photograph. It showed the angels lined up on Main Street that final morning, moments before they'd ridden out of town. In the background, Frank could see himself standing in his damaged yard, hand raised in farewell. Below the photograph, someone had written a single line: "We protect those who protected us." 6 months after the incident, Frank Morrison stood at Martha's grave in the Millstone Cemetery, holding a bouquet of wildflowers she'd always loved. The winter morning was cold, the mountains to the east dusted with fresh snow. "You would have been proud of me," Frank said quietly, or maybe horrified. Hard to say. He told her about Reeves, about the debt, about the standoff and the storm cellar, and the complicated honor of dangerous men. He told her about Webb's transfer to Reno, about the federal investigation that was still ongoing, about the trial dates set for the arrested rattlers. "I got a Christmas card from Reeves," Frank continued. "Picture of his family, wife, 2 teenagers, a dog. Looked like any other American family, except he was wearing his patch in the photo. That made me laugh, very on brand." The wind picked up, scattering leaves across the cemetery. In the distance, Frank heard the sound of motorcycles on the highway, someone passing through, heading somewhere else. The sound no longer made him tense. Now it just sounded like freedom, like the open road, like people living life on their own terms. "I've been thinking about what you used to say," Frank told Martha's headstone, "about how the measure of a man isn't what he says he believes, but what he does when nobody's watching. The angels didn't have to come to Millstone. They didn't have to risk themselves for a deputy they'd never met. They didn't have to show restraint when they could have shown violence. They did it because of a code, not law, not duty, but code, their own sense of what's right." Frank placed the flowers on Martha's grave. "I think you would have liked Reeves. He's a good man who's made bad choices, or maybe a bad man who's made good choices. I'm not sure which, and I'm not sure it matters. What matters is when it counted, he stood up. He protected. He honored his word." As Frank walked back to his truck, he saw another vehicle pulling into the cemetery, a pickup truck with Nevada plates. The driver stepped out, and Frank recognized him immediately. Reeves, dressed in civilian clothes, but with the death's head patch sewn onto his jacket. They met halfway across the cemetery grounds. "Captain," Reeves said, extending his hand, "didn't mean to interrupt. You're not. What brings you to Millstone?" "Just passing through. Heading to Ely for a meeting. Saw your truck, thought I'd say hello." Reeves glanced at Martha's grave. "Paying respects?" "Something like that." Frank looked at Reeves closely. The big man looked tired, older somehow than he'd appeared 6 months ago. "Everything all right?" "As all right as it gets. The fallout from the Rattlers' arrest is still unfolding. Some of their associates are looking to re-establish themselves, trying to prove they're tougher than the guys who got caught. Keeps us busy. Keeps you playing guard dog." "That's one way to put it." Reeves smiled slightly. "The other way is we're keeping communities safe from people who would poison them. Literal poison, in the form of meth. Figurative poison, in the form of violence and intimidation." "Is that the code?" Frank asked. "Protecting communities?" "Part of it. The code's complicated. It's about loyalty to your brothers, respect for those who've earned it, and protecting what's yours. Sometimes what's yours is just your charter, your territory, but sometimes it's bigger. Sometimes it's about drawing lines that shouldn't be crossed, like dealing to kids, or letting drug dealers terrorize small towns." They walked together toward the cemetery entrance, boots crunching on gravel. "Deputy Webb's doing well in Reno," Frank mentioned. "Called me last week. Says he's learning a lot. Good. Kid's got potential. Just needed the right guidance." Reeves stopped at his truck. "Captain, I wanted to ask you something. If you ever need anything, and I mean anything, will you call me? Not because of the debt, but because we're friends, or whatever the equivalent is between a retired firefighter and a motorcycle club president." Frank considered the question. They were an unlikely pair, separated by age, lifestyle, legal status, and probably philosophy. But they were connected by something stronger than any of those differences: mutual respect forged in fire and tested in conflict. "Yeah," Frank said. "I'll call." "Good." Reeves climbed into his truck, then paused before closing the door. "One more thing. The journal I sent you. Did you read all of it? Every word? Then you know we're not perfect. We've got violent men, criminals, people who've done things they're not proud of. But you also know we're not the monsters people assume we are." "I know that you're human," Frank said. "Complicated, flawed, but human. Following a code that makes sense to you, even if it doesn't always align with the law. That's all we can ask for. Understanding, not approval, just understanding." Reeves started his engine. "Take care of yourself, Captain. And if Millstone ever needs us again, You know how to reach me." As Reeves drove away, Frank stood in the cemetery parking lot, watching the truck disappear down Route 50. The morning sun was higher now, burning off the frost, promising a clear day ahead. Frank pulled out his phone and looked at the contact he'd saved. Daniel Reeves, Northern Nevada Hells Angels, President. He didn't delete it. Instead, he added a note to the contact, a man of his word. 1 year after the incident, Frank Morrison sat at his usual booth in Murphy's Diner, drinking his usual coffee, watching the usual flow of morning traffic through Millstone. Life had returned to normal, or as normal as it could be after a town became briefly famous for a biker standoff. The federal trial of the Desert Rattlers' leadership had concluded with convictions on multiple counts: drug trafficking, conspiracy, weapons violations. The sentences ranged from 15 to 30 years. The Iron Vultures, having cooperated with prosecutors, received lighter sentences in exchange for testimony. Deputy Webb, now Detective Webb, had returned to Millstone for the trial, providing key testimony about discovering the stash house. He'd visited Frank during his stay, looking more confident, more seasoned. The transfer to Reno had been good for him. Sheriff Bowman had retired, recommending a younger deputy, a woman named Sarah Cordova, as his replacement. The county had approved the appointment, and Sheriff Cordova had immediately reached out to surrounding departments to establish better information-sharing protocols. What had happened in Millstone, she'd said in her first press conference, should never happen again, not because bikers intervened, but because law enforcement should be coordinated enough to stop drug operations before they required intervention. The Hells Angels hadn't returned to Millstone, but their presence was felt in subtle ways. A donation to the volunteer fire department, new playground equipment at the elementary school installed by anonymous donors, scholarships for local kids funded by a Reno-based foundation that Frank suspected had ties to the club. The code, it seemed, extended beyond protection to investment. The Angels had claimed Millstone in their way and were taking care of it. Darla refilled Frank's coffee. "You hear about the new stoplight they're installing on Route 50? "Can't say that I have. State Transportation finally approved it, said we met the traffic volume requirements after that incident last year brought so much attention." Darla smiled. "Funny how a near disaster sometimes leads to improvements." Frank nodded, understanding the deeper meaning. Millstone had been ignored for decades, too small to matter, too remote to prioritize. But the standoff, the federal investigation, the media attention had put the town on the map. State and federal resources had followed, along with infrastructure improvements and economic development initiatives. "Strange silver lining," Frank said. "Strange everything," Darla agreed. "But we're still here, still standing." Through the window, Frank saw a motorcycle pull into the parking lot. Not a Harley, but a smaller bike, a sport model. The rider removed his helmet and Frank recognized him. Ethan Chen, Mayor Chen's son, home from college for the summer. Ethan entered the diner, ordered coffee, and approached Frank's booth. "Captain Morrison, got a minute?" "Sure, Ethan, have a seat." The young man sat down looking nervous. "I wanted to ask you about something, about what happened last year." "Ask away." "I'm studying criminology at UNLV. Been thinking about law enforcement as a career. But what happened here with the Angels and the Rattlers and everything, it made me realize that law enforcement isn't always clear-cut. Sometimes good people operate outside the law. Sometimes bad people hide behind it. How do you navigate that?" Frank thought carefully before answering. "You navigate it by staying true to principles, not just rules. Rules tell you what's legal. Principles tell you what's right. Sometimes they align, sometimes they don't. When they don't, you have to make hard choices about which one matters more in that moment. But doesn't that lead to chaos? If everyone just follows their own principles instead of the law, that's why we have laws, Ethan. They create structure, predictability, fairness. But laws are written by humans, enforced by humans, and interpreted by humans. They're not perfect. Sometimes the gaps between the law and justice are so wide that people step into those gaps and try to do what they think is right, using their own codes, their own principles. Ethan absorbed this. The Angels had a code. Yes, and you respected it. I respected that they followed it consistently, that they honored their word, that they showed restraint when they could have shown violence, that they worked with law enforcement instead of against it. Did I agree with everything they've ever done? No. But in that moment, in that situation, they were the right people in the right place doing the right thing. Detective Webb said something similar, said the angels taught him that policing isn't about enforcing rules, it's about protecting communities. The rules are just tools to do that. Frank smiled. Webb learned that the hard way. Hope you don't have to. After Ethan left, Frank sat alone with his coffee, thinking about codes and principles and the complicated machinery of human society. Laws created order, but codes created communities. Both were necessary. Both were flawed. The trick was knowing when to follow one and when to follow the other. His phone buzzed. Text message from Reeves. Article in today's Reno Gazette. Thought you should see it. Frank opened the link. The article was about a new program in northern Nevada, a community watch initiative where motorcycle clubs partnered with law enforcement to report drug activity, human trafficking, and other serious crimes. The program was controversial, with critics arguing that it legitimized criminal organizations, but the initial results were promising. Reported drug activity was down 40% in participating counties. The article included a quote from Sheriff Cordova. "We don't endorse everything these clubs do, but we recognize they have eyes and ears in communities where law enforcement has limited presence. If they're willing to report crimes instead of handle them extrajudicially, that's a step in the right direction." And a quote from Reeves, "We're not trying to replace law enforcement, we're trying to supplement it. Our community, the biker community, has always policed itself. This program just creates a channel to share information with official authorities when appropriate. It's a partnership, not a takeover." Frank texted back, "Interesting approach. Think it'll work?" Reeves responded immediately, "Time will tell, but it's better than the alternative. Clubs and cops treating each other as automatic enemies. Maybe we can find a middle ground where both sides benefit." Frank set down his phone and looked around Murphy's diner, at Darla behind the counter, at the farmers and truckers at other tables, at the small-town life that had nearly been shattered by violence, but had survived through an unlikely alliance. Maybe that was the real lesson of Millstone. Not that bikers were heroes or villains, not that the law was always right or always wrong, but that human society was complicated, messy, and required constant negotiation between competing codes and principles. And sometimes when the system failed, individuals had to step up and bridge the gap. Even if those individuals wore patches that made people uncomfortable, followed codes that weren't written in law books, and operated in grey spaces that defied easy categorization. Frank finished his coffee and stood to leave. As he walked out, he paused at the door and looked back at his usual booth, at the spot where he'd sat for 40 years watching life unfold. Martha would have approved, he decided. She'd always believed in judging people by their actions, not their appearances, by their character, not their affiliations, by what they did when it mattered, not what they claimed to be. The Hells Angels who'd protected Millstone had passed that test. They'd acted with honor when honor was needed. They'd shown restraint when violence would have been easier. They'd kept their word when walking away would have been simpler. That was the code. And maybe, Frank thought as he stepped into the Nevada sunshine, that code was worth respecting, even if it came from an unexpected source, even if it challenged assumptions, even if it forced people to see past patches and leather to the human beings beneath. He climbed into his truck and started the engine. Route 50 stretched out before him, empty and open, promising nothing and everything at once. Frank drove home thinking about debts paid, codes honored, and the complicated truth that sometimes the people who protect us don't wear badges, they wear patches, and sometimes that has to be enough.